This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. For this episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, I'm out in Downers Grove, Illinois. It's Sunday morning. Fobab was yesterday. I'm recovering from that with some hair of the dog, some Pilsner in front of me. And joining me for this episode is Tom Beckmann, co-founder of Goldfinger Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you very much. Excited to be on.
It's this awesome lager renaissance here in Chicago, and it's interestingly, so for folks that have read our Best in Beer issue, which will be out by the time we're actually recording this before it's out, but it will be out by the time people listen to this. For those that have read our Best in Beer issue, Goldfinger, our readers tend to like you guys. They like you a lot. They, the Chicagoland crew showed up and voted in a heavy way in our reader survey. And so you will find Goldfinger both on the list of favorite small breweries and their list of favorite lager breweries. Very high up there on their list of favorite lager breweries.
Wow.
So anyway, I don't want to spoil the surprise for you.
That's great to
but
hear.
everyone listening to this will know by the time it comes out. That got me thinking we should have a conversation about the way that you brew lager. And got me out here to Downers Grove on a train this morning before I fly back home later today. Anyway, we're going to talk about lager brewing. We're going to talk, for those of you who read our lager issue earlier this year, Goldfinger scored a 93 with their pills, and there's lots of Nader. Doppelbock scored a 94. Our judges are they're getting on well with the beers that you've been sending to us, and so we're going to talk about how you brew pale lager. We're going to talk about how that expresses itself through some of the kind of Polish hopped expressions of pale lager that you make. And we're also going to talk about this Zoigl project that you've launched, which is a really cool one. Love this Zoigl tradition, and we can talk more about that later on. We're gonna dive into all of that, but first, G&D Chillers, the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, are proud of the cool partnerships they've built over the past 30 years. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Want to maximize efficiency in your chiller? G&D's micro-channel condensers are designed for less power draw. Their lighter weight and more compact design uses up to 70% less refrigerant, which means a lower GWP and lower operating costs. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, this episode is brought to you by our friends at BSG, who invite you to experience one of the newest hops from their Hop Solutions line, HS Grove. Developed for hop-forward beer styles, HS Grove boasts incredible biotransformation qualities, giving you the power to transform your next IPA into a stone fruit powerhouse. Choose HS Grove for West Coast IPA, New England IPA, Double IPA, American Pale Ale, or any beer style where delicious fresh fruit aromatics are desired. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more. And is your brewery making its own ciders, seltzers, and other beverages beyond beer? If you need a central source for fruit flavor, Old Orchard has you covered. Old Orchard supplies flavored craft juice concentrate blends to beverage brands for the production of beer, cider, seltzer, wine, spirits, kombucha, and more. Flavor your lineup and streamline your sourcing by heading on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Tom, I can't wait to let you talk. After all day of Fobab yesterday, my voice is going. I'm holding on here, just barely. So why don't you, the way we normally start off here, give us your background and history. What was your path through brewing, and then ultimately what led you to create a lager focused brewery right here in Downers Grove?
So started home brewing with my brother, who is one of the partners in Goldfinger. We were living in downtown Chicago at the time, super into cooking from scratch, and we were also really into craft beer at the time. And we started with like a kit to make this porter, because I was really into porters at the time. And it was so exciting to brew our first beer from scratch, but my goodness, was it terrible in hindsight. Like, did not pan out the way we wanted it to. But I just immediately started doing as controlled experiments as I could, given our stovetop system at the time. But we were doing all grain brewing right from the beginning. And right around that time, we also had kind of rediscovered our connection to brewing historically. There was essentially an estranged side of my family that we lost touch with just because they were in a region of Europe that had been conquered, in Poland specifically. So pre-World War I, it turns out I have lineage in brewing. My ancestors, the Goldfingers, were brewers and brewing equipment manufacturers and also hops dealers in Czechia and in Poland. They had a nice brew pub in Krakow, and one of their claims to fame was that they were the official welcome beer for Kaiser Wilhelm's visit to Poland for the first visit. So they were producing a significant amount of beer at the time, and it was at that point my love for brewing at home that I felt that it was just running in my blood, and I set out to revive the old family tradition. But I realized I wasn't going to be able to achieve that just doing small 1-gallon batches at a time. So I ended up enrolling in the Master Brewers program with Siebel and Domens in Munich. Once I graduated, I started working at Lagunitas Brewing Company as a brewer, making a ton of IPA.
Sure.
Which is funny because most of the brewers were just so excited every time we got a chance to brew a Pilsner as opposed to an IPA. And I moved on from Lagunitas to work in the brew pub atmosphere. I was working for Emmett's Brewing Company, which is a chain of brew pubs in Chicagoland that's been around since the late 90s. So I cut my teeth on some really old equipment, falling apart equipment on a 15-barrel system in this brew pub atmosphere. But it was great because it was all manual. I got to brew all sorts of different styles. But throughout all of this, lager has been kind of my preference in drinking. And the fact that the Goldfingers were growing their brewery right at the time that lager yeast had been isolated and had overtaken Europe. It was kind of a combination of what I love to drink and what we believe our ancestors were likely brewing at the time that led me down the path of opening a lager-only brewery.
Sure. So, what is the brewery, like you come up with this idea and you want to focus on lager. What did that mean for starting this brewery? I mean, this is a tight focus, but it certainly meant that, you needed to make something that was going to be noteworthy and also build a brewery that could actually make those beers the way you wanted to make them.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, on so many levels, it's a risk from the production of it, from the time it takes to produce, and then, of course, what was popular at the time or what continues to be the most popular craft beer, which is not lager. But it was where my passion was, and I knew that if we were going to do this, we had to go all in and go all in the right way, and that began with having a very clear vision of what our production setup is going to be like. What is the brew house going to contain? How are we going to figure out what we do on the primary fermentation side versus the lagering side? What are our SOPs on lagering? And of course, those have changed over the last 3 years in certain areas, but generally speaking, the infrastructure was the first consideration of how are we going to achieve this lager only focus. I found out very quickly, literally like the first day we opened, that I had underestimated the need for tanks for lagering because
sure.
It wasn't like, oh, it looks like people are just slamming our original lager, which is our Helles. I should just brew a quick batch of that. It was like, well, 2 months from now, I'm going to have another batch. So we've gotten it wrong many times, and I'm sure we'll continue to get it wrong in terms of infrastructure and SOPs for a good while, but we've learned a lot, and we continue to adjust to be able to make the same quality of beer and actually improve the quality of it without compromising our process and what we set out to achieve.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the basic structure. You do decoct some of your beers. You ferment both in cylindrical vessels as well, and then lager in horizontal tanks. Just talk about some of the basic structure of your approach to brewing lager.
Sure. So right now we have a 3-vessel brew house, a mash mixer, which is steam jacketed, which will allow us to step mash as well as just control any kind of mash. We're using it as our cereal cooker for right now because we use corn grits for our Mexican lager. Eventually, we're actually expanding our production a little bit, so we're going to be adding an additional vessel that'll allow us to do decoction mashes and cereal mashes in a separate vessel because we're currently doing it in one of the 3 vessels on our brew house. Right. So that's creating a bottleneck for growth.
Can't be boiling if you need to also be decocting. Sure,
precisely. Sure. Yeah. So, but we are decocting our Helles. It's a single decoction. Our Vienna lager is a double decoction. And so we have all the piping necessary on our brew house to achieve that, move mash back and forth. We also chose to aerate with sterile air as opposed to straight oxygen. So we have a whole setup of drying. We basically just have an air compressor, but we go through a series of filters and dryers to get it to a food grade dryness, and then sterile filter right before our heat exchanger. The whole point of that being, that's how Germans typically don't use oxygen because it's not technically Reinheitsgebot. They have to use sterile air because sterile air is readily available. Pure oxygen would be considered an additional ingredient. But also because what I learned in the Master Brewers program is there is some data to suggest that by aerating with sterile air, which is about 20% oxygen, you're not stressing the yeast out, whereas you could be stressing the yeast out if you exceed a certain amount of oxygen in the aeration on its way to the fermenter. But of course, that only works if you're knocking out very cold, because the solubility of sterile air is not quite as good as pure oxygen.
Right.
So you have to be really cold. And that was part of our infrastructure too. We wanted to do everything nice and cold from start to finish. So we have a cold liquor tank that'll let us get down to a nice cold knockout temperature, absorb the level of oxygen that we want.
How cold is cold there?
We're knocking out at 7C right now, down from 8C before. We cooled it off just a little bit. The whole idea between that and how we separate yeast from the initial fermentation and then lagering, all of that is geared towards doing it slowly and doing it gently and cold. So beginning with knockout, make sure when that yeast is in contact for the first time with that wort, it eases into its growth and fermentation. Keep fusel alcohols down, just kind of give the yeast on its own time to grow, to ferment the beer. We actually never exceed 9C. 9C is the fermentation. We keep it there. We don't do warm diacetyl rests. We just go from 9 down to 8 right before we are thinking of transferring. And the way we determine if we're going to transfer is what kind of carbonation we want in the finished product, because we're doing natural carbonation with all our beers. So we'll run a forced ferment test to tell us where this batch is going to terminate. And based on a calculation, usually bung the tank around 1.1 Plato left before fermentation, drop the temperature down 1 degree over 24 hours, then another degree down to 7 to help promote yeast collecting down into the cone. So that's why we decided we wanted to do primary in the conical so that we could more easily harvest the yeast. So then we'll rack the beer off into a horizontal at 7 degrees, and we'll leave it at 7 degrees for its diacetyl rest for about 10 days. Once it passes VDK, then we drop down 1 degree every day until we get to a -1 set point. We can achieve sometimes -1 or at least 0 degrees Celsius for lagering.
Yeah. That extremely cold process the entire way, the intention is to not stress the yeast and let it move slow, but obviously time in a brewery is money. At the same time, you must have to, you're making some other adjustments in terms of yeast pitch, to try to help that along so that, even though it's moving slow, that you're not going to debilitate your yeast in that process.
Yeah. I think, and that's something that we continue to tweak and run some experiments on what is our optimal pitch rate, but typically we err on the side of a little bit more yeast just to make up for that. Most of the stuff we're doing is not stressing the yeast out, but the fact that we're naturally carbonating, of course, CO2 is toxic to the yeast. So there is a little bit of stress, but what we like out of that is that there's, I'm going to say a dirty word in lager brewing, but there's some ester production that's created in a good way. So yeah, we're when I say we're running experiments, we're trying to figure out essentially what we can get away with in terms of amount of yeast that we're using. There have been a couple of batches that we felt that there's almost too much yeast character, maybe as a result of putting not so strong yeast in or too much of it. So that's one of a few experiments we're running right now. But generally speaking, we've kept the same kind of SOP for yeast pitching, which is just pitch more.
Sure. Well, I want to talk to you about like clearing VDKs without a diacetyl rest. Before we do that, ProBrew is excited to announce that they are currently featuring short lead times between 2 and 4 weeks for their in-stock ProFill rotary can fillers. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 plus cans per minute while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, fill out their contact form on www.probrew.com or email contactus@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. Also, you like wildly aromatic IPAs and tropical lagers? Good thing. Omega designed thiolized yeast for just that reason. Thiolized yeast are a new tool for brewers to bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. And wait, there's more. Omega yeast makes yeast to order with a consistent 1-week lead time, ensuring peak freshness and reliability. So let's talk about that, Tom. Do you in terms of clearing VDKs, do you then leave that for an extended time?
Yeah.
Usually time is the other solution.
Time is the solution, as long as you're not going too cold. Otherwise, you're in Czech territory there. Too cold, too quickly, I should say. Right. There's definitely diacetyl being cleaned up at 7 degrees. You could even go colder, but it is time. So what would potentially take 24 to 48 hours takes 10 days. But it's not the only thing that's happening over the course of those 10 days. So it's not like we're losing all this time. I mean, ultimately, we're lagering these beers on average in the lagering tank for 6 weeks to 6 months in the case of our Oktoberfest. So there's not a major rush. So in that VDK rest, it's just kind of starting off the second chapter of the life of that beer, which is post-fermentation. There's still a little of fermentation occurring there because, as I stated before, we're transferring with a little bit of fermentation left so that we can carbonate because we're not krausening. But it's also embarking on this new chapter where things are moving slowly but cool and flavors are starting to meld. Some kind of undesired flavor compounds created during fermentation are starting to be reconsumed by the yeast, and everything is sort of softening and bodies being created. Some aroma compounds are being kind of interacted with the ethanol that was created. So it's just it's a nice long process that achieves many things at the same time. It just so happens that we call it our diacetyl rest because that's ultimately what's going to determine whether we can lower the tank set temperature. And once we do, that's when we slowly drop it.
So you move it at that point, you move it out of the CCV into a horizontal tank where it still continues to then carbonate, clean up VDK, and after about 10 days, you then drop it to lagering temperatures.
Correct. Yep.
Cool. And then, where do you lager at, and how long does it then, what's the tank residency now, in your lagering phase?
For our Helles and for our Helles.
And you don't transfer to another vessel after that VDK process. You're still leaving it in the same one.
Right now we don't. We will, with this expansion, we're putting our first bright tanks in just for packaging purposes. We will be filtering. Most of our clarity comes from the natural lagering time, but we do, on certain beers, add some biofine to get the nice, brilliant color or clarity. We'll be moving away from that and going toward filtering into a bright tank with this expansion. But yeah, we're just we're sitting in the tank for our Helles about 6 weeks. The way we've determined the tank residency is really sensorically. Like, does this taste where we want it to taste? And one thing that we learned when we were determining this was that we were judging a lot of things based on the set temperature, or based on the pigtail on the tank. Let's taste this. How does it smell, taste? Not even considering the fact that it's super cold at that point. It's not even going to be at serving temperature. So, things that we thought were not coming out as much as we wanted it to were just a function of how cold that sample was. So we've dialed that in a little bit. I mean, it seems so obvious, but it wasn't at the time. Yeah, our set temp is trying to be at -1. So we're trying to be sub-zero, so that we can really kind of promote the natural clarity more than anything. That's what we're hoping for when we get super cold.
Sure.
Flocculation.
Yeah. Talk to me about, obviously you're using decoction for some of the beers and not other beers. What is some of your decision-making process around, some of that technique, when you do choose to use it and when you don't choose to use it?
Yeah. So with our Helles, we do a single decoction. The reason we do it single instead of double is we've never tried to do a double, but we've certainly done batches where there's no decoction and then a single. Not on the commercial level. It was all kind of experimental batches leading up to this. But what we found was, more than anything, the body that we were looking to achieve in our Helles was significantly different than an undecocted batch. So that's how we decided to move forward with that. Because
different in what way?
A little rounder, but it's an interesting one with the Helles. It's round but then dries. So the decoction's helping maybe create a little more fermentability, but the Maillard reactions are also creating sort of a complex, maybe bolder initial body. And when we think of Helles, we think like nice malt sweetness on the front end, and then but still dry enough that without being super hoppy, so that you want to have another one.
Yes. No, and it's funny because we've described it the same. I've had this conversation over this weekend before, but I think that's the magic of that. That's what makes lagers delicious. Not the minimalism, but this idea that they change. You should get that malt and fullness in the initial sip, because that just, it hits those pleasure centers, right? It's like, oh, this tastes great, and then it still has to finish dry.
Right.
And so, when we say things, things are sweet, like, well, yeah, they're sweet at very first, and then they dry. Like that's the secret to like really great drinkable lager that people want to keep drinking. And it's obviously the Czech magic where they, drinkability, pitelnost, like that's. I think they were anyway. I think you're right. I think that decoction can play a strong role in building that.
Yeah, and I think when I try other Helles, I wouldn't really categorize our Helles as a Munich style, because I think first and foremost it's a little bigger. It's 5.2 ABV, so it's slightly bigger, but also I feel like on the front end we might be, for certain styles we might be, or for certain iterations of Helles we might be slightly sweeter, but then we also have more hop character on the back end. So I would think of ours more so in like the getting closer to Czech border, like Eastern Bavaria, let's say, like where they're not afraid of using hops. The Münchners seem to be scared of hops lately. So, but anyway, yeah, that's why we decided on the decoction for the original. With the Vienna, that was a decision because we were going to have these pale lagers as our flagships. But I wanted to cover a more malt forward spectrum. Now, I would categorize all our beers as malty beers, but malt in a different way. It interacts with the rest of the stuff differently. With our Vienna, I wanted it to be more of a noticeable, like toasty malt character, so that for the customers who want that, we had something to offer them. And I felt that doing a double decoction on that was going to allow us to achieve more of those flavors. As a result, though, we're able to have a 5.5% Vienna lager that drinks like a really light Pilsner, because we also weren't shy about how we hop it. And we use Czech Saaz in it, so it's nice and spicy and fairly bitter. As far as why we didn't do a decoction on Pils and our Mexican, well, Pils, because we wanted that to be what we would call our more hop forward lager, so something where the hops are really kind of what shines without just being kind of a bitter light lager. So we've just had one. You'll notice there's still some malt body to it, but definitely more of a hop flavor and a nice kind of drying hop bitterness on the end. We felt that decocting that might have gotten in the way a little bit. It wasn't necessary. The malt that we're using is just so beautiful anyway. We're step mashing that one to make sure that we're extracting exactly what we want, but we didn't feel that a decoction was necessary on that. And the Mexican lager, just because we're already doing a cereal mash on it, and that was the element that I would categorize. There's always, when I think of a recipe, okay, so there's 4 ingredients, but when we break down what the malt character is going to be like, what are we looking at achieving? And it could be everything from the actual malt flavor to even potentially some interesting sort of, I don't want to call it astringent, sort of like polyphenolic function in the mouth. Like, is there potentially, not without, we don't want to extract a lot of the phenols from the husks, but is there some potential in the quality of this malt that's going to add sort of a different feeling in your mouth, like on your cheeks? Is this going to be like a little bit drier? And then so when I think about that realm in terms of the Mexican lager, we were using flaked maize for a while, and I felt that the flavor was where we wanted it, but there was a character on the mouthfeel that we were getting that I didn't like. It was this almost close to oxidized character. And I think it was just a function of like, this is already gelatinized corn that's sitting in a bag in a warehouse. It was still fresh, but like there is still this kind of like staley quality to it. So we started running experiments with getting just corn grits, ungelatinized, and doing the gelatinization in the brew house, and the results are just unbelievable. We're getting a tighter body. We had a little bigger body than I wanted, and it's super fresh and a gentle corn flavor, but just not over the top. So that's how I kind of think about all the decoction versus all the ways that we mash our beers.
Very cool. Well, let's talk about some of that malt, because I think that's interesting to think about malt, not just in terms of flavor, but also, you know, the kind of mouthfeel, but impression, the kind of, tactile quality that malt can give to, you know, a beer that's sitting in your mouth. Like, talk to me about how you have selected malts for each of these beers, or I imagine there's probably some commonality in Pilsner malt between them, just for brewery efficiency's sake and whatnot.
Yeah. We started off using exclusively Weyermann malt. At my previous job, I was using Best Malts for all the German beers. What was cool about that brew pub is if we were going to make a specific regional style, we were trying to use those regional ingredients as much as we could.
Sure.
Best Malts is a good malt too, but I just liked Weyermann's Pilsner malt better. So we use that until, well, we continue to use it, but we use it exclusively until it became hard to get because of COVID and the supply chain issues. And then it just continued to increase in price and continues to increase in price. Although I think it's finally hit its ceiling at least. So we were forced a few times to experiment with some other malts. And one of my favorite malts that I've found domestically is a RAR North Star Pils. Super local. It's in Minnesota.
Sure.
It's cheap, and it's the closest thing I've found domestically to a continental European malt. So we had, over the last year and a half, have run experiments with certain percentage of that with Weyermann malt. And we actually snuck in a batch of our Helles of exclusively North Star Pils. Nobody could tell the difference. I could, and not in a great way. I think it was still a delicious beer, but the North Star tends to be a little huskier, more than what I'm looking for. So that's why we started kind of doing blends. And right now, I think we're at a 50-50 blend of Weyermann Pilsner and North Star for our original and our Pils. Our Vienna continues to be exclusively Weyermann, and our Mexican lager is now exclusively North Star Pilsner. So we're complicating things in terms of procurement of raw materials, but we're going to continue to run different ratios. But North Star is a little lighter in color, and we thought that was perfect for our Mexican lager.
Interesting. Well, I still want to ask you about like how you describe the actual tactile sensation of those malts. Before we do that, brewers, are you looking for the best beer, mead, and cider recipes on the planet? Join the American Homebrewers Association to unlock the 2023 National Homebrew Competition medal-winning recipes. American Homebrewers Association members have access to nearly 1,400 trusted and tested recipes, plus a Zymergy magazine subscription, exclusive discounts, live webinars, instruction videos, and more. Plus, sign up for a membership by December 31st, 2023, and select a free brewing book, a $25 value. Learn more at homebrewersassociation.org/CBB pod. Also, we've got some exciting news from GW Kent. They're expanding their product range to include many varieties of RDOC cans, can handles, cleaning chemicals, and quality malts. Now, you can shop spare parts for the cellar, ingredients for the brew house, and canning supplies for the packaging team, all in one convenient location. GW Kent's new and improved website makes it easier than ever to quickly obtain the materials you need to keep your business brewing. Start saving today at gwkent.com. So, Tom, you talked about the tactile experience of malt. I want you to let's dive into that a little bit, because I find that interesting, and it's not something that a lot of folks talk about. As you were relating to these malts, like, how do you describe some of the difference in the way that they, feel and create texture, to the beer itself?
Yeah, I think one of the clearest examples that we've come across in brewing our beers is the difference between that North Star Pilsner and the Weyermann Pilsner malt. And I think a lot of it has to do with the husk. Obviously, we're trying to not extract any of the husk material when we're producing the wort, but I think always it's inevitable. There is some soluble phenols that are, or tannins that are going to come through to a varying degree. And with the North Star, it was more obviously that. So the way that translates into the finished beer is, when your mouth dries up, you start to feel some saliva kind of collecting, maybe on your cheeks or in the back of your mouth, and some of that is a function of hoppiness, but also some of that is the tannins that are in the beer. And I felt that created a drying effect almost to a fault. It was a little too excessive. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at like what is the quality of honey is a very typical characteristic in our beers that we're getting from the Pilsner malt, but
just as a flavor descriptor, not actual honey, right?
Right, exactly.
Or not.
Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, as a flavor descriptor, and I think the honey. I always think about the honey and just the malt flavor in terms of like weight, not actually putting it on a scale, but like how does this weigh on my palate? And some of them are very kind of creamy. You get like this really light, airy honey quality to it. So another malt that we've played around with is Weyermann's Extra Pale malt, and that has sort of a less deep honey character. It's very light. Like when I'm a big fan of honey in general, and when I think of it, I think of like more on the lighter side of like the color side, of course, but also just how it weighs on your palate. It is like, is it super cloyingly sweet, or is it this kind of gentle combination of cracker and honey? Whereas the Weyermann malt, regular Pilsner malt, has more of a, in my opinion, more robust honey quality to it that we're extracting, especially in a decoction. So then again, it's like weight. Weight has a big influence on how we're making our beers. Is this something that's just going to slide right through the palate, or is this going to stick around a little bit?
Sure. Interesting. With your decoction process, is there any specific technique in terms of time, in terms of, is this a direct fire decoction vessel? Are there any methods to the way that you actually decoct other than, I have been talking to folks this weekend about their direct fire decoction, and there are some hardcore believers in that. There's I've talked to lager brewers in the past who are using different timing for their decoctions in order to accomplish specific goals. For you, what does that decoction look like?
Yeah, it depends on the style that we're making. If we're doing any kind of Czech beer, we're usually trying to use under-modified Czech malt. So we're doing a triple decoction on that. And that's really to kind of break down some of the proteins that are usually going to be kind of more complex, more protein rich, but also just the sugars aren't going to be quite as accessible. So we're doing very cold initial rests with an element of decoction. But with our standard beers, it's not a direct fire. It's in our steam kettle. I don't have a strong opinion, but I think one of the common misconceptions with like a direct fire is you don't want to scorch. Decoction doesn't mean scorching. Doesn't mean like when you have
That's what the chains are for.
Yeah,
the chains
exactly.
They keep it from scorching.
Right. Yeah. So I could see there could be some benefit to kind of maybe even the uneven heating of a direct fire. I don't know I'd be curious to hear why people are more proponents of that, but what we're trying to achieve isn't necessarily like caramelizing malt in the decoction. It's just exploding some of those sugar packets in there. And the only variance we have in the decoction, aside from the actual timing, which depends on single, double, or triple, is the amount of time we're actually decocting it. So for our Helles, it's shorter. Our Vienna the first decoction is a little bit longer than the second decoction. So the second decoction of the Vienna is the same time and same timing as the first and only decoction of our Helles. And that's just because that's what was right.
All right. Highly scientific.
Yeah.
Let's talk about in terms of Helles and your standard pills. Let's talk about hops, and then the boil process here.
Sure.
How did you mentioned Saaz earlier, and you also mentioned that your Helles is definitely a little hoppier than a lot of Helles, and that's your preference. And talk to me about how you select hops and how you then time hops, and what your ultimate goal of using hops in both the original lager and pills becomes.
Yeah. how I select hops with our beers is completely based on what I have used in the past at other breweries and or beers that I revere. So one example, like with our Pilsner, it's a combination of German tradition and German Tettnanger. And Tettnanger is probably one of my favorite hops.
Why?
Because I think it's a great example of a balance between some kind of peppery notes, but also floral notes. And it is also the hop used in my favorite Pilsner ever, which is the Tegernsee Pilsner. And it just so happened that I went to Domens at the same time as one of the Tettnanger or one of the Tegernsee brewers. And after a couple of beers, he shared with me what hops they use.
So that's how you get it out of them.
Yep, couple of beers. I mean, read the book by Andreas Krenmeier about Vienna. It's basically like a spy novel about these Germans and Viennese guys who saw that the Brits were making pale malt, and they were like, let's go see how they do that and bring it back.
But today we have a culture of sharing in craft beer that's much more open and much more quality focused for everybody. It's much less cloak and dagger stuff.
Exactly.
Now we just put it out there on a podcast. Everyone
precisely. So you've just shared
their Tegernsee secret with the entire brew.
I did.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Right. I'm sure they'll go under as a result of it. But I love that hop anyway. So with that one,
you blend a little bit then with it.
We do. We only use the tradition for the bittering side, and then we do 3 additions. The second and final edition are just Tettnanger. And that one, we actually do a whirlpool edition.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you believe it? That's also a naughty word in traditional German brewing, right?
So why then do a whirlpool edition rather than keeping it, cooking all your hops?
Yeah, that's a good question. A question I've been asking myself recently and have been interested in exploring. That was definitely my American brewing influence on here, because I worked for Lagunitas. I worked at a brew pub. We were doing American style. So that was more of initially just, we want to have this beer be more aromatically hoppy than the others. And traditionally, a good experience, in my experience, later editions is going to achieve that. Now, whether we're getting the same kind of aroma that we would have gotten, or could we achieve that aroma with maybe just still prior to Whirlpool some additions? Possibly. Something worth exploring, I think. I know that there's some research about kind of the difference between how a hop expresses itself, particularly noble hops on the hot side versus not so hot. But I still consider a Whirlpool, the way we're doing it, a hot addition. We calculate the isomerization as if it were a hot addition anyway. So I think we're still achieving.
So you're adding those when you're not cooling down your whirlpool then.
Correct. It's just spinning it to separate the trub, and we're adding it then. So it's still like almost boiling.
Right.
Just under boiling. But the whole goal, of course, was to try to get more of the hop aroma.
Sure.
With the Helles, we do, our last edition is 5 minutes before boil, or before boil end. And when I say hoppy for our Helles, I don't necessarily mean bitter. I just mean hop flavor. There's noticeable hop flavor, and it's Hallertauer Mittlefrüh exclusively. And that's basically a smash beer.
Sure.
Pilsner malt.
Why Mittelfrüh for Helles? And also, I know you have calculated IBUs for it. Where do those land? Even if they're not sensorially, they don't align necessarily with some of those numbers.
I just like I like Mittelfrüh. To me, that tastes that's quintessential German. Having beers in Munich and across Germany, just Mittelfrüh is such a beautiful, beautiful hop. So, and and it doesn't contain the same level of kind of pepperiness that a Tet would, and I didn't want a peppery Helles. I wanted some kind of gentle floral with a little herbal character, and Mittelfrüh was up for the task. Our target IBU on that beer is 18.
Okay.
And on our pills, it's 32. But, the IBU scale is what it is.
Right.
I wouldn't say
imperfect at best.
Yeah. That those two beers are drastically different in terms of their bitterness. Very different quality, though.
Quality. When you say that, how would you articulate a difference in quality of bitterness?
The quality of the bitterness in the pills has much of what the original has initially, which is hop flavor, hop aroma, but the pills deliberately has a sharper kind of bite on the end versus the Helles, which is supposed to be more tapered and doesn't linger as much.
Sure. Interesting. Well, it's funny to me. The last couple of days, the Dovetail folks are also cool ship hopping. They cool ship all of their beers, and so in that same kind of way, they are adding a significant hop load. Theirs though actually drops down in temperature. We made the joke that they are cool ship pooling or cool pool. we're gonna
cool
coin
pool.
the cool pool, KOELPOOL, cool pool. It's gonna be
I like that.
the newest brewing term that we've coined through this process. But I think it's interesting that there's also some commonality there that you are both trying to push some more of that kind of aroma and through this kind of process, and that is what is going to make these interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I want to continue forward and talk about again, since we're on some of the hop topic, let's talk about the way that you have then tapped back into some of your family's Polish roots and some of the Goldfinger history, and because you've also launched a series of Polish Pilsner where you get to explore Polish hops and the way that those express in the beer. Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Sure. Our Polish Pils series, I guess, technically started for our first Lagerversary beer, because that was our first technically Polish Pils. But we ended up using we were the first ones to use the thiolized lager strain.
Ooh.
And
Omega is right here in Chicago, so
right.
makes sense.
Right.
Sense.
Yeah. And I think some things have changed since that one. It was it's so funny. It really showed the spectrum of people's preference. I don't typically like sulfur in the beer too much. I think our beers have the appropriate amount. Certain ones might have a little bit more than others, but none of them are that's not the first aroma that's really standing out for our beers. That Polish Pils, that first one we did, holy cow, that was a sulfur bomb. And we let that lager a long time. That didn't clean up the way we were hoping it would, but it was an experiment, and that's how we presented it to people. And we had some people. We still have some people saying it was their favorite Pilsner we've ever made. But that was our first time combining some Polish hops in a Pilsner setting, albeit with the thiolized yeast. So from that moment on, we knew we wanted to start a series where we're featuring different Polish hops, because the goal is to kind of showcase hops from our ancestors' homeland, and also shed light on the fact that there are really nice hops that are being grown there, and actually in many cases cheaper than German or Czech hops. And many of them are very similar. So we started making a Pils with, the Pils is basically a German Pils base, but started adding combinations of hops, different Polish hops. And so we're on our third one, which we're drinking right now, which is the first one of our series where we're using more of a new wave Polish hop that we've called Princely, and it just translates to princely from Polish. And the descriptors there are apricot and coconut, and depending on the day and what you've eaten before, you might be able to pick up on some of that stuff. But we've gotten a lot of excitement about these series. I know some people have been reserving a can of each of the ones so that they can do side by sides, and it's been fun. We will continue to do it because there's a lot of combinations. We have a lot of different Polish hops and access to a lot of different Polish hops, and it also helps us determine which ones we want to use in some of our other beers because other beers have used that. I'm sort of promoting Polish hops in a lot of our collaborations that we've done. I've brought some.
Sure.
Our Baltic Porter uses exclusively Polish hops. So it's just a fun way to do what I was kind of doing as a home brewer, which was just same base and let's just alter like one element of the beer.
We've been loving, Polish lagers, Polish pilsners. Last year, one of our beers of the year was Otherland's Hallertauer Special Polish Pils. Again, Ben and Carolina. Carolina is Polish, and it's a way to tap into that family history. Live Oak, it's fun to watch these kinds of family expressions within some of these, but making some phenomenal beers along the way.
Dusan and I we compare notes because he's made Pivko Pils and he's made some other ones. He was the one who introduced me to the Polish hop distributor here, and then the owner of Polish Hops, and because the first beer that Dusan and I made together was a Grodzickie. Which they do such a beautiful one.
Oh, absolutely.
And of course, I wanted to use Polish hops for it, and so we've continued to do that. But
get you in with his malt supplier too.
He sure did.
Oh yeah.
We used his malt supplier. He's actually the one that sends us our corn grits too for our Mexican. So
cool.
Awesome guy. Great brewery too. So we have a lot of fun together.
Absolutely. So, and that actually brings up the last thing I want to talk about on the podcast, which is the American Zoigl project, which is something that you actually launched alongside Live Oak.
Yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit, and then maybe you can start by talking about the whole Zoigl tradition and what inspired you all to kind of follow down that road.
Yeah, I think so. We've started a tradition where we brew a beer with Live Oak for our anniversary every year since we've been open. And it started with a Grodzickie. We did a pre-prohibition style lager for our second lagerversary, and then we needed to come up with another style for this past lagerversary. And I think it was probably Dusan who was just like, what about a Zoigl beer? And we kind of went back and forth about what that could be, because it was right when I was very interested in cereal mashing and gelatinizing in-house and stuff. So kind of a combination of what I wanted to do with the beer and how we wanted to interpret the Zoigl tradition resulted in what we're calling an American Zoigl. So the Zoigl, the German Zoigl tradition dates back to the Middle Ages in the Oberpfalz region, where basically a community would pool together funds and have a single kind of capacity to brew wort, and each household would take turns fermenting that wort. And when that wort was ready to be consumed, they would hang a brewer's star, the Zoigl, outside of their door, and that would let the villagers know that they could go inside and enjoy the fruits of their labor. And they would literally convert their living room into a place to just drink with their neighbors. So we love that idea. And as far as the style goes, it's not necessarily super polished BJCP style guidelines. So we took some creative license there, but we use that as sort of a foundation. We decided that color was probably to be around a coppery or deep gold, but we also wanted to do, because I was interested in American ingredients, and Live Oak does a lot of American styles. We don't do as much, so it kind of presented an opportunity to create this new American lager, which we called American Zoigl. So it's all American ingredients with the exception of a little bit of British crystal malt in it. For
crystal malt.
Can you believe it?
All right.
Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Here we are.
But it uses corn grits and
not even like Munich malt, just crystal malt.
Crystal malt. Oh. Yeah. Corn grits, and then American North Star Pilsner malt, and then we used cluster hops, and whole cone Mount Hood hops.
Well, all right.
Yeah, so real classic American there, and we bagged those hops up. It was fun. First time we've used whole cone in the brewery, and the idea was to give it a very American flavor, but with still kind of not departing too far from what we envisioned a Zoigl would be. It wasn't actually until after we brewed it that I started to think like, well, there's an opportunity to create kind of a Zoigl inspired tradition here. So I had the idea of actually making a Zoigl star and hanging it out of our brewery for when we tapped it, which we did for our lagerversary, and it stayed out there while we had the beer on tap, just letting all the villagers know the Zoigl's ready. And I had my father-in-law actually build it, and me and the brew staff ended up signing the back of it, and we thought this would be cool if we just ship it to breweries around the country and they do the same thing. We can send them the recipe and they can, interpret it how they want, but just stick to this kind of Zoigl tradition, pass it on. So Live Oak did their version of it, and they hung the Zoigl above their brew house while that was on. And our next one in line is Urban Chestnut, so they'll be receiving the Zoigl next week, I believe, and they'll be releasing that beer in December, and they'll be hanging that star up. And they have a beer fest actually, or a lager fest that they're doing, and they're going to talk about the Zoigl tradition because Florian is a German, obviously. Right. But I created an Instagram account, American Zoigl, and we, on our Goldfinger account and on the Zoigl account, said, hey, if there's any breweries that want to be a part of this project and just keep passing this along like a chain letter, let me know. And I got almost 70 requests from breweries across, awesome. I think across, at this point, like 40 states.
Wow. So the Zoigl star will be making its rounds over the coming years.
Yeah, and hopefully everybody's going to sign it, and I'd love to try their interpretations of it, and just kind of keep it moving along. I like it for two reasons. One, we're kind of focusing on an American style lager. I think that isn't clearly defined right now, and there's some macro breweries that have claimed it for obvious reasons, but I think we can reimagine what that is. But also in a time in our industry where some things are in flux, it's a healthy reminder that we're all kind of in this together still, and people still get excited about little projects like this and collaborations like that.
I love it because this is an incredibly nerdy corner of the lager world. When Joe Stang and I were in Prague, Czechia, and then also in Bamberg earlier this year, we actually drove between. I rented a car in Prague, and we drove between Prague, Žatec, and Bamberg. And on our way back from Bamberg that Sunday morning, we stopped through the Oberpfalz and actually went to Knobloch first, and then we popped out to Windischenbach. And because there are a couple of towns that still have these traditional communally owned breweries that then each of the families takes turns brewing on, like you said, and then it's their weekend to open. And so now the star is there, but I mean, they also put it on the internet as to who's open on any given weekend, and so
sure
you can actually figure it out, and plan a trip. They're very different lagers. Like, they are not anything like what you would think about in terms of like Munich, the kind of Munich pale lagers. Like there's a fullness to them. They're definitely on this spectrum. They are Franconian lagers, but because the Oberpfalz is also so close to Czechia, there's all of these interplay between these two. They're just not. You have some like stereotypical idea of a Munich pale lager. Like this is not it at all. Like right, copper to like a deep golden, almost amber color, like fruitiness. Like they're pulling out. They're using German hops, like, but pulling this lime character out of the hops they're using. There's just this big fullness to it. But what a cool tradition to just pop into that family, and I was amazed at just how well developed some of these family homes serving Zoigl. Like
amazing.
I mean.
Were there other people there drinking?
Well, we were there not as many. We were there pretty early, and
okay.
It was but I mean a beautiful home with like a full restaurant. I mean, they full kitchen. Like I mean, it would. These families go all out. It's a very cool tradition to be to see in person. I was glad that we got to do that, but it's also cool to bring it back up. Because. Yeah. It's a small thing. Like I said, there's just a couple of cities now that still do that in that Oberpfalz region, and cool to highlight that just as part of this broader beer and lager tradition. That anyway, let's talk a little bit more just about the beer itself. And
sure.
I love this idea of using American hops. How did you and American ingredients to create this? Talk about some of the kind of parameters and the envisioning how you saw like building this kind of base recipe was going to work and make because you want it to be American, you want it to feel different than the German or Czech or Polish inspired lagers that you're also making.
Yeah.
But it also has to like all hang in that same kind of your consumers here need to still be able to relate to it.
Yeah. Definitely seeking a different overall experience than what our traditional lagers were. That was kind of the first goal, was this is going to be an American interpretation of a Zoigl, but for all intents and purposes, just an American lager of a different inspiration. And since we don't do American lagers very often here, that was going to be easy to achieve just through American ingredients, but that wasn't enough for what we wanted to do. That's why we teamed up with Yakima Chief. They supplied the hops for us because we were. I think Nico even said he like blew some dust off of some cluster hops in the back of their cooler. Like these are hops that nobody's using anymore, really, or very few people. They're not exciting. They're not sexy anymore. Which is why we liked it.
Bring them back, exactly.
Which is why we liked it, exactly. Because the Zoigl tradition in Germany is old. It's been going on for a long time. So it wouldn't have been fitting to get some really nice kind of hype, tropical, fruity American hops. Let's go. What American lager might have been or was at the time that those hops were really popular. So we just wanted to express that and express sort of a cereal grain quality to it. And I think in hindsight, we need to come up with a better method for using the whole cone, because I think we ultimately wanted to extract a little bit more aroma from the whole cone Mount Hood than we did. I think just as a function of we tied like mesh bags full of whole cone hops into the kettle, and did what it did. It still turned out really nice, but we were hoping it would be just a touch hoppier than it was. Live Oak's version, I think, did end up being a little bit hoppier, but kind of like how you were describing what Zoigl in Germany is, it's a different style. It's not what you would imagine. And the way we thought about the Zoigl project was, let's just kind of share the foundation. So if you're one of the participating breweries, you get the box with the Zoigl, and inside it is the recipe that we used, our recommendations, a little history of the Zoigl tradition, and the goal of the project, and then a plea to pass that on to the next brewery. So we just wanted to make it truly American, and I think using those ingredients helped achieve that.
That's awesome. Well, we've been talking for a little while now, and it's almost time to wrap up, but I want to kind of pull back and think about big picture. You got started in the midst of the pandemic. in 2020. You were able to finally realize this dream of your own lager brewery, that pays homage to your family's brewing history. It's been a tough couple of years within, brewing as a whole. It's hard to even look down the road and think about, what's in the future. But try to, envision for me if you can, like what do you hope, the Goldfinger becomes over the next 3 years, over the next 5 years? Where would you like to go with this? And how do you see it, a few years down the road?
As far as our vision, it's funny because I think about this from two different perspectives. I think about it as the responsible father of two and husband. Let's keep a nice, sustainable business, which we're grateful that we have right now. But I also feel like as a brewer, I want more people to appreciate lager outside of what I feel most American beer consumers do when they drink lager. So I think I feel like I have a responsibility to the industry to help promote what lager could actually be here, not just the yellow, fizzy, tasteless stuff that is everywhere, but actually something that can still be more enjoyable and enjoyed en masse. So I would love to continue to grow our brewery. I would love to be on tap anywhere we can where somebody's willing to drink a nice craft lager. Somebody who understands that there's some premium beers out there and they're worthwhile. They're worth the money. They're worth the focus. So we haven't really kind of aggressively gone after the Chicago market, being that we're about 25 miles outside of the city. We've just started having the ability to have more capacity to go on draft at places, because for a long time we were struggling to keep up with the tap room. But we've added tanks, and we're going to continue to add more, because if there's an opportunity to have a lager beer on draft at a nice restaurant or some place where somebody just wants to drink a nice lager, I would love for our beer to be there, and hopefully the person enjoys it.
Tom, I've enjoyed your approach to lager brewing, and these expressions that you make. Obviously, our blind judges have as well, and I appreciate you talking with us about it. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. HS Grove from BSG gives you the power to transform your next IPA into a stone fruit powerhouse. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends your next craft beverage. ProBrew has rotary can fillers in stock with a 2 to 4 week lead time. Omega stylized yeasts bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malt and hops. Join the American Homebrewers Association to unlock the 2023 NHC medal-winning recipes. And GW Kent now offers an even wider range of spare parts, canning supplies, and ingredients all in one place. If you've enjoyed this episode, go to this beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, show us that this content matters to you, and become a subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing. And also, get to read wonderful things like our Best in Beer issue, where readers the Downers Grove Chicago Metro voters out in force supporting Goldfinger, Hop Butcher, Dovetail, and others, just voting. I really impressed to see just how passionate the Chicago crowd was in voting this year, and also voted Chicago the #1 beer city in North America. First time that's ever happened. Congratulations, wow, Chicago voters, from getting out there. But anyway, nonetheless, Tom, if people want to learn more about Goldfinger, both in real life and out there on the internets, where do they find you all?
So we're right now we're across Chicagoland, cans and on draft. At certain places, you can just reference our website. We have Find Our Beer page on there. We have our tap room at 513 Rogers Street in Downers Grove, accessible by Metro, as you know.
As I do.
And
really easy trip out of Chicago Union Station.
Yeah, Chicago Union Station. And if you come during the weekday, there's express trains that'll get you here in 20 minutes.
Oh, so. See, you can't not do that, right?
And then
And I didn't have to drive, which means I can just have another Pils or lager or whatever.
Sounds good. And then if you follow us, Instagram is where we put a lot of our focus online. So at Goldfinger Beer, that's where you'll see our journey through lager production. We like to share details about how we do it. So hope you'll follow us.
Fantastic. Can't wait to see after Urban Chestnut where the American Zoigl project lands next. Tom Beckmann, Goldfinger, thanks for talking with me on the podcast. Cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.